Welcome to part 3 of my series on elemental systems. In this video, I will attempt to create a more standardized model for visualizing elemental systems across various canons, employing information gathered from my previous research into classical and pop culture systems. We can expand on that real knowledge to develop fake models for fictional storytelling. With all of what I've learned in mind, let's finally dive into my proposed system. This system comes with two halves, an alignment chart and a visual interpretation methodology. The first part asks the question, what does the author think an element is? The second part asks, how are the elements related to one another within the system? What is an element? The alignment chart. The elemental systems I've shown in this series have operated at varying degrees of separation from archetypical systems, like the roots and the Wujing, often becoming more abstract in their definition of what could be considered elemental. This is somewhat justified, as the original role of the elements, arche, was to explain the primary law of the universe, why things are the way they are. There's room for interpretation with different approaches. However, after so many degrees of separation from those original ideas, it becomes harder to reconcile why certain concepts should be included as on the same level as others. Alignment charts are a sort of logical diagram, developed as a way of organizing the relationship between different systems or structures. Several popular formats are available, but the one important for our purposes are comparisons of form and function. These two measures are placed on axioms of traditionally purist to radically rebellious, with a middle ground present as the neutral position. I've created the chart below, which will hopefully convey my intentions in this discussion. Numerical is the form factor, while categorical is the functional factor. As someone moves from purist to radical along a single axiom, either right or down, the semantic expression of the term element must be rationalized to some degree. I can see why someone might consider the four fundamental forces of physics to be elemental, or how the D&D alignments are more metaphysical divisions of constant universal themes akin to elemental forces. However, when simultaneously shifting towards the rebel stance along both axioms, the resulting position includes systems that are largely unrecognizable to the original purist stance. Whether you're applying this concept to elements or mecha or sandwiches, the overarching pattern is this. The further along either axis you move, the more resistance that will be invoked by including progressively radical stances. In other words, if your elemental system includes something stupid, you better be damn prepared to justify that design choice. In addition to all of the various elements in the systems I've previously discussed, here's a short laundry list of ideas that could potentially be considered as elements, but may not fit the bill entirely, depending on what you're defining an element as in your system. These are somewhat ripped from research into actual things that people have made, but some of them are just from my own inner thoughts. Do not judge me. Sun and moon, angel and demon, order and chaos, mind and body and soul, emotions and logic, acid or corrosion, animal, illusion, magic, ki, chi, mana, technology, dust, explosion, steam, life and death, space and time, star, color, crystals, minerals, or gems. I really don't know why people get hooked up on that. Force, radiation, tar, plasma, mud or clay, dark matter, dark energy, antimatter, or any other weird stuff you can pull from science fiction. Take what you will from that list, but I don't recommend being too grabby. Next, geometry. I'm going to attempt a semi-logical approach to this visualization as the system is based in geometry, that is. Let's posit that all elemental systems can be represented as a combination of points and lines in three-dimensional space. At each named point, there exists a primary element. These primary points are reserved for the most significant, distilled, or basal elements in the system. Between each primary element, there are a number of lines, or line segments. Each line represents either a relationship between the two connected primary elements, or a secondary element positioned between the two. An elemental system is defined by the polygon or polyhedron formed by those dots and lines. This way, we can borrow from mathematics instead of creating our own convoluted naming system. That may not have made the most sense, so let's give a few examples of what I mean. Take the original 4 roots as primary points. There are only a few significant ways to arrange them, using lines of relation. You could form a straight line, defining the system in terms of a single scaled factor, like density, as the Greeks did to explain the arrangement of the earth and the heavens. Earth at the bottom, then water, and then air, and then fire, and then the sky. They could be arranged according to any given metric, wetness, flavor, whatever is your choice. Alternatively, they could be arranged as a variety of squares or quadrilaterals. You could imitate a rock, paper, scissors system like the one found in fossil fighters, where the elements hold dominance or submission to one of the other 4, and no relationship to the 4th element. Or, instead, the lines could represent acceptable crossover or intermingling with the other elements positioned for contrasting pairs. Each member of one pair can interact with one of another, but neither component of the pair is allowed to exist in conjunction or combination with the other component. These connective lines could be secondary elements, like metal, life or nature or plant or grass or whatever you want to call it. Changing the position of each primary element, by extension, determines what the connective secondary elements would be as well. Another way of ordering these 4 elements is to break into a 3rd dimension, using a tetrahedron instead of a quadrilateral. Here, each primary element holds a relationship to each other. This arrangement may imply that there is less in the way of opposite pairs, but more that each element exists as its own extreme, extending out from an origin point. Or not, it's all up to definition by the system's author. By using polygons and polyhedrons as visualizers of an elemental system, the relationships, or lack thereof, between any 2 elements is more formally entranced in the system's structure. From a creative standpoint, starting with a set number of points, then picking from one of the legal forms and working backwards to figure out what your elements will be, may provide a novel perspective for developing an elemental system. Let's look at a few more numbered combinations for ideas and examples. 2-element systems are a bit dichotomous, and there's no getting around it. Calling them elemental systems may even be a stretch, but I think that the label still applies. If elements are divisions of the world and its components into separate, distinct categories, the least that you can have is 2. Some examples of this may include dark and light, good and evil, order and chaos, hot and cold, fire and ice, wet and dry, creation and destruction. There's also an interesting case to be made in the Mesopotamian ideas of freshwater and saltwater being the basis of the world, but Tiamat is a bit too much to get into for this video. All of these are basic descriptors of either very influential and overpowering characteristics of the surrounding world that a culture may come in contact to, or dichotomies of value and associated ideas, with all other aspects of the world falling somewhere in one of those 2 spaces. Here's another idea. In a computer simulation or code-based society, 1s and 0s, or on and off, could be used as the 2 most basic elements. An element is what the world is made from, and in this case, they would literally be made from arranged bits and bytes. What kind of element is an AND gate, or an OR gate, a NOR gate, a NAND gate? I'm not a computer scientist, so I'm not going to keep talking. To what degree could the Holy Trinity be considered an elemental system? Probably not too much without invoking some sort of blasphemy, but I'm sure someone could do something with that. I tend to envision 3-element systems in 2 overarching flavors. First, there are extrapolations from 2-element systems. If there is good and evil, what exists in the middle ground, or around the outskirts in the absence of either? You could think of good, neutrality, and evil classification systems as elements in their broadest term, or even order, neutrality, and chaos. Take one of the previously mentioned 2-element systems and find a 3rd partner or middle ground. Secondly, there are condensed systems. You'll see these in elemental systems where the 4 or 5 element model has obvious influences, but the design spaces limit the number of categories available. Sometimes 1 or 2 elements are combined, or one's functions are divided among the other parts. Air and water are often partnered, opposed to fire and earth, or one aspect is abandoned entirely. Think of land, sea, and sky, solid, liquid, and gas, fire, water, and grass, tank, DPS, and support. Now, we already talked a bit about 4-element systems, so I'm going to skip past those. Also, is the political compass an elemental system? You decide for yourself. Tell me in the comments below. The Wu Jing more or less already uses ElementFreaks' designer geometric elemental system. or edges for short. I'm not copywriting this. This goes in the Creative Commons. The Chinese represented the 5 phases using connective lines and arrows that visualize their relationships. This is a good example. But another example that I'm reminded of is the mana system from Magic the Gathering. The 5 colors of mana are arranged with similar relationships to the Wu Jing, although with no relations of dominance or submission. I think that you could also break symmetry a bit to introduce either Aether or Nether into the Greek roots, but neither is a bad choice, in a bit of a square pyramid shape. A square pyramid shape physically sets Aether above the 4 roots, keeping in classic feature, while allowing each of them to be related to each other in some way. In expansion to a 6-element, Nether is commonly presented as the opposite to Aether, giving that dark and light, good and evil dichotomy, so you could also place it beneath the pyramid to form an octahedron, with essentially 3 sets of opposite pairs. Moving into systems with 6 or more elements, permutations are going to be a bit of a problem, and we enter what I call higher order elemental systems. We're at the point where the number of potential connections between primary elemental points grows at an exponential rate with each addition. Too many dots and lines just makes the whole thing look like a jumbled mess. If the connections are fully realized, that is. The more absolute based elements that are included in a structure, the more difficult it becomes to justify the logic of the system. Most of what you'll encounter in existing fictional systems will be one of the following: random disconnected dispersal with no obvious organization, a linear pattern, triangular, square or tetrahedral, pentagonal or pyramidal, hexagonal or octahedral, octagonal or cubic. And I guess you could also have a circular model with an infinite number of points representing more of a continuous elemental spectrum. So I guess if you want to include that in here, that also sort of works within the system. More or less, if mathematics should allow it, this should allow it. So yeah, this idea probably needs quite a bit of refinement, but I feel like I've laid enough groundwork to start some actual development and application. Listen, I'm not an academic. I don't get paid to care about those kinds of things. I'm an engineer. I just build stuff. Think I'm missing any interesting points or factors? Let me know what suggestions you have. Comment below any series where you think that the elemental system would stand out. Subscribe while you're at it. In video 4, I'll be diverting from the immediate topic to one that I feel is closely related: color, or specifically basic color terms, in a bit of a tie-in to the last video that I made. So, until then, freak out.